Welcome to the Innovation Ecosystem Podcast, where we interview remarkable and thought-provoking guests from the worlds of business, academia, sports, science, and the arts. We firmly believe that while innovation is simple, it is not easy. It requires an open mind. It requires cognitive diversity. It requires curiosity, which is why on this podcast, we explore the subjects of innovation and change from multiple perspectives. We look at topics through different lenses. We hear about how small I innovations can compound over time. We show you how you can exercise your innovation muscles and make you and your organisation more innovative and better able to respond to change. With your host, Mark Bidwell.
Hello, this is Mark Bidwell. Welcome to the Innovation Ecosystem Podcast. Now, in this episode, I'm pleased to welcome back a previous guest who appeared in Season 1, all the way back in Episode 8, Steven MacGregor, who talks to me about his new book, Chief Wellbeing Officer. Now, Steven's an entrepreneur and an academic, active in the world of executive education, and founder and CEO of the Leadership Academy of Barcelona. He's also a former international-level duathlete, currently racing for FC Barcelona. He's trained with Olympic athletes, Tour de France cyclists, and Ironman champions, and can be found on a frequent basis running up and down the mountains overlooking the city of Barcelona. And I follow him on Strava, and I just get tired purely by looking at his workouts. Now, this is the third episode of Season 5, and in our conversation, we dig into topics that we covered with Ed Hess and Angela Duckworth earlier in this season, albeit from very different perspectives, such as the importance of passion, humanity, and leadership in the age of AI and robots, the Stockdale paradox, and the challenges of holding two conflicting opinions at the same time, which is very much a characteristic of operating in a VUCA environment. Now, Steven has first-hand experience in helping executives and high-performing athletes raise their game in a way that is sustainable and endures over time. And I loved his example, for instance, of how the British Olympic cycling team took full advantage of marginal improvements across a whole range of activities, including learning how to wash their hands as part of a strategy that culminated in 22 gold medals in the last 3 Olympics. And Steven practices what he preaches. He actively experiments with nudges at his academy in Barcelona, as well as talking honestly about his personal journey raising his own game. So there's a huge amount in this interview with Steven MacGregor. I hope you enjoy it. So, great pleasure to have Steven MacGregor on the show today. Welcome, Steven.
Thanks, Mark. Great to be here.
So how do you answer the dinner party question, what do you do?
It's an interesting one. I mean, I interviewed him on my own podcast a few weeks ago, Kenneth Mickelson, who's the lead author of a book called The Neo-Generalist, and just talking about, this day and age where everyone's careers or increasingly are very hard to define because they're interested in so many different things. And when we first met, he gave me a copy of the book because he guessed that I would have trouble answering this question. So over the years, even, talking to my parents or friends at a party or dinner party, as you say, I've often struggled with that. And I remember I talked about this in the interview with Kenneth, several years ago, someone asked me, what do you do? And I said, various things. And he said, well, what are you, a drug dealer or something? As if I was trying to hide what I was doing by some generic term. But I don't know. I'm a teacher. I guess my market these days is very much executive education. A lot of teaching at a lot of the leading business schools worldwide, ESA in Barcelona, IMD in Lausanne, CIBS in Shanghai. And I have an academic background, but I wouldn't say I'm an full-time academic or professor. I'm an entrepreneur as well. 10 years ago, I founded the Leadership Academy of Barcelona. So yeah, I'm a mix of that. I think entrepreneur, academic, and with a focus I have had the last 10 or 12 years on the area of health at work. So I don't know if that's how that would go in a dinner party, but that's as close to it as I could maybe get.
No, but I mean, you raise a good point. I mean, the label, we get defined by our labels, and we have to be very careful about what labels we apply because that shapes our thinking, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And even in recent conversations, I've been very, my own interest has been piqued by people, instead of asking, what do you do? They've actually said, what are you passionate about? What really gets you energized? What gets you excited? And especially if that's someone that I've just met in those first moments, I find that it's quite a disarming question, but it's pretty interesting.
Yeah. Well, and the great thing is, everyone's got an answer to that, right? So it's a sort of a way of connecting very quickly with someone.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, and again, it was something I talked to Kenneth Mickelson about, is by uncovering a little bit more on passion, it really connects us to the other person. And it tells us often so much more than a label would, I think, especially in this day and age when there's so much change out there and we're involved in so many different fields and just with the importance of curiosity, right? A label often limits, maybe not intentionally, but it often does limit what we do or what we're interested in, just the confines of that label,
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, Stephen, I mean, you recently published a new book called Chief Wellbeing Officer, and the aim of which you write is changing your mindset to the world around you. So how does the book do that?
I mean, what we're trying to do, we're trying to legitimize health and well-being. Over the last 10 or 12 years, I haven't been attracted so much to the word well-being. I've always felt it was a word in business that had connotations of just doing less work, not being a high performer and just being less serious, a business term in general. So kind of shied away from it until I found the term actually from the Do Lectures. So the Do Lectures are a fantastic, in my view, UK-based think tank. And they released a report last year called the Stress Report. And one of the quotes in that was about how companies in the future would need a chief wellbeing officer to look after people. And I thought it was just such a great term. And I know that there's been whispers out there in the last few years of chief wellness officer, wellbeing officer, and even chief happiness officer more the last couple of years. But I just thought it was a term that really did capture the essence of taking these elements of health and well-being and putting it, with chief and officer being on either side of it, not necessarily saying, let's have a chief wellbeing officer within a board level company, or it could be, but it was actually just getting people to think on changing their mindset, on actually saying our humanity is increasingly important within the world of work, and especially in the future, and everyone talking about fourth industrial revolution, where the focus is on the rise of robots and artificial intelligence. It really will be humanity that allows us to thrive. And I just felt that term chief wellbeing officer was something that would allow us to do that. So within the book, we just look at what that means and guidance that we can give for a company or indeed an individual to just increase their humanity within the workplace.
Right. And you mentioned the fourth industrial revolution. So I think the book starts with, where we are now. And there's a chapter called The Best Time to Be Alive. You also bring up in that chapter the concept of the Stockdale paradox, which I absolutely love as a sort of a mental model, if you like. Be interested in, maybe you can just explain describe it for listeners. But then secondly, to what extent does the Stockdale paradox actually, is that a good way of looking at the environment that we're in today from a business or from a social perspective? Interested in your thoughts on that.
I mean, there's no doubt that, we're in a very complicated age, but, some of the graphs that we show in chapter 1 is taken from our world in data. And it's the world is 100 people over the last 200 years. And we see that things like, extreme poverty is decreasing markedly, literacy and education is improving around the world. So a lot of the data points to, today being the most advanced time in human history. But of course, there is more inequality. There's more challenges going forward, maybe more monopolies, the negative side, dark side of social media and all these things. So we have that trade-off or that paradox. Wanted to draw out, I just wanted to have an optimistic view of the world, right? And I think it comes back to the mindset that you talked about. We can frame our reality, the same reality for two people, but just how we view that, it gives us so much about our own behavior and how then we act with other people. So I don't know, I just prefer to stay on the optimistic side and the positive side of the world. But I think the other point also, and this is what I've also found over the last 10 or 12 years working in health and business, is that many things are within our own control, right? We complain about, work or executive work, or it's the company's fault or the environment, or even in Scotland, right? I'm used to it's the weather, right? Everyone blaming the crap weather. And I just feel that if you believe that you can take action and you can be proactive in making the change. It sounds a little bit, a bit oversimplistic or a little bit romantic, right? But I just think it makes such a difference.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this concept of gratitude, I mean, there's a lot of work coming out in this subject now, which is, if you have a mindset of gratitude and of openness, you can't feel depressed if you're grateful, right? I mean, there are lots of negative emotions that are almost impossible to feel if you actually are feeling grateful. And I'm with you, but I'm curious. I mean, just to sort of fill the story out about the Stockdale paradox, because it's a wonderful story. I mean, the guy I think was he was stuck in Vietnam. I think, wasn't he? He was in a prisoner of war camp in Vietnam.
Yeah,
he survived And when he was asked why he survived, he said he was able to hold these two very conflicting perspectives. One was quite how serious his situation was, but at the same time have a very powerful, vision as to how he could emerge stronger and become free from the situation and go on to lead a very successful life. And I think the question was, a lot of people said, well, how did you survive when others didn't? And he said, well, if people held only one of those views, they were most likely to perish in those very difficult situations. But he believes that his success in surviving and thriving was because he was able to hold those two very, very extreme views at the same time.
Yeah, and it's something, I guess taking on from that point, we talk later in the book also about the importance of ambiguity or those are extreme views, but also sometimes it's about holding two opposing views in mind at the same time in business, right? And F. Scott Fitzgerald, that quote, the test of a first-rate intelligence is to hold two opposing ideas in the mind at the same time and still, retain the ability to function. And we often get that in today's society where there's no right or wrong answer. It's often very contextual. And even in business, you're trying to be short-term, long-term, or innovation and operations. And I just think, being more tolerant for ambiguity in today's world or holding extreme views in mind, it helps in many, many aspects, right?
Yeah. And just wrapping this part up, because I was keen, there's a lovely example in the book of a company that might perhaps have been optimistic about the strength of its brand. This is a very well-established company. And in an onboarding session, they discovered that, that those assumptions weren't quite correct. I'd love that. It's a nice little cameo story, but maybe can you just tell us that? Because it does bring out a couple of interesting themes.
Sure, it was a mutiny, right? Essentially, they had that. It was a well-established, as you say, company. We're not going to name names, but onboarding process for about 300 new graduates. And whereas in the past those graduates would just, be more than grateful just to be in the door, and actually from those 300 were selected from a massive influx, right? Many thousands of new graduates wanted this job. And in the past, the brand luster would have been enough for them to perhaps be in the onboarding process and to go through that, relatively passively and just be grateful for being there. But the chief HR officer got a call one day into it and saying that 250 of the 300 wanted to go home because they hadn't fulfilled their expectations, right? So I think that tells us a lot about today's generation, being very demanding, maybe being critical or perhaps overcritical. And then the result being the HR officer, could have perhaps fired them or just recruited the next 250 on the list. But she went, flew in because she was only due in day two, but she flew in early and she said, okay, if you don't like it, then you redesign the process that's going to, satisfy yourself and everyone else. So it became a complex problem for them to solve, right? And it was also a test for them. So it wasn't them just being, which I think, many of today's generation, or maybe we're all guilty of this, we're very quick to criticize, but we don't often offer the solutions to address those criticisms. So it was a real test for them to address, their criticisms in the first place, right?
Yeah. And what was good, we won't name the company, but what was fascinating about that example is that the head of HR did actually reframe the problem and, turned it back to them. And the reason I wanted to get into that, Stephen, is that those behaviors that person demonstrated are, they're echoed further into the book when you talk a little bit about the skills of the Chief Wellbeing Officer. And I'm curious, maybe let's get into that because, you touched on one earlier on around exposure to ambiguity. What does that look like? What does good look like in in a leader who is exposes themselves to ambiguity? How do they do that?
I guess it's having that flexibility, not to just go down the one solution path and think that's the right answer, but actually to be very open to different inputs that may come from the workforce, it may come from more empowerment in the workforce, or it may come just from a changing landscape, right? New technologies or things that, it could have even been a product or certain ways of processes or doing things in the company that have, made the company successful for a long period of time. And then because the context changes, they just have to, very quickly pivot and completely transform their way of doing things. And I think traditionally that hasn't been easy for senior people. Often the leader in a company has been the one with all the answers. But nowadays the leader by no means has all the answers. They have to be receptive and, receive those answers and make a judgment call, right? So I think a lot of it links to, these skill sets that, my own background is in design, product design and design management. And these skills, we've called them the design vowels, which we can talk about in a second what they are. But a lot of it links also to recent work on digital transformation, the new type of digital leadership, agile leadership that companies like McKinsey and IMD Business School are looking at in great depth. And one of the mantras I think that comes from this whole area is strong opinions loosely held. It's perfectly fine to change your mind if you have the evidence to back that up. So I think tolerance for ambiguity is just having that flexibility, that openness to actually, okay, I think I have the answer today and I'm going to stick with that, but tomorrow something could change and I have to be prepared to pivot to that other point.
Yeah. The other piece around the exposure, I mean, there was a thing in the Financial Times a few weeks ago by Gillian Tett talking about Jamie Dimon, who got on a bus with a bunch from JP Morgan, took a bus ride with a bunch of his senior managers around the West Coast and the Rockies to meet customers and to meet employees. And it was, some parts of the press said, this is, publicity stunt. But Gillian was making the point that this exposed him to very different, fresh perspectives that he wouldn't get, sitting at the top of his, ivory tower, essentially. Do you see that kind of behavior in some of the organizations or the clients that you work with?
We're trying to encourage it. I don't think it's easy. I think in terms of design, and I think some of your own background, Mark, you'll be aware that, getting into the field is important to get the answers, right? And whether it's in the ivory tower for an academic or in the, the 50th floor of the CE office for in the business sense, getting into the factory floor, over the years, there's been methods that have encouraged that in management by walking around, for example, right? But, with my own background in design and doing ethnographic field work and talking to people, not just in focus groups, but in their natural environment, you get the authentic answers, right? You get the real answers. So a lot of the work that we're doing in terms of, agile being a hot topic just now is actually trying to talk to senior people and saying, okay, how do you get out and even talk to humans, right? It's a popular book in the last couple of years from the agile and lean UX field, talking to humans, right? It's actually getting out from the kind of over-analysis that you may do in terms of all the data that you're collecting online and just being on the computer, but actually going out onto the street and observing something or just talking to someone, striking up a conversation. If you're the CEO of a telco, when was the last time, or even a senior director in the telco, that you went to a store and you just looked at that experience, right? Maybe you have to wear a disguise so people act authentically. So it's something that we are trying to encourage in our conversations with senior executives. It's not easy to do, but I do see evidence that more of it is happening, Yeah,
I mean, because my background, originally I'm an anthropologist, and that's all around the core approach. I mean, you mentioned ethnography is participant observation, and I mean that's so observation is another of the skills of the Chief Wellbeing Officer. I mean, I'm curious. I mean, how does that look, if you like? I mean, how do the conversations go with the senior executives around helping them become better observers?
I mean, it could be external, so it could be related to that aspect of getting outside and getting into the field, but it can also be an internal thing. A lot of it is just picking up on signals. So even, over the years and weeks, signals and innovation, and sometimes it's just talking to these busy people and saying, create more space. Create more space in your agenda, create more space in your life. Don't always be running about and being over busy, because that's when you tend to observe less and pick up on these signals, these important, weak and critical signals to a lesser extent. So sometimes it's just, and we advocate mindfulness as many people have done over the last few years, but just even reflection on a basic level. And it could be at the end of a day, or it could be at the beginning of their day. And it could be related to what we talked about earlier, right? The gratefulness journal, for example, and actually to think back on what happened in that very busy day for a senior exec, and not just the bad things, but actually what were the good things that happened. So observation is kind of all of those things, and also relates to the way that they engage with the workforce, because often the more senior someone is, the more that they talk, the more that they participate, because they're giving answers, they're giving direction. But often we say, how can you listen a little bit more? So observation is also very much listening and active listening. And from that, just encouraging engagement from the rest of the workforce, right?
Yeah. And I think the concept that we use quite often is this idea of observation without judgment. And there's a great quote, I'm going to get the guy's name wrong, Krishnamurti, I think, who says that the highest form of intelligence is the ability to observe without judging. And I feel it's up there with the F. Scott Fitzgerald quote that you mentioned earlier on, but it is really hard, particularly, I guess, if you've been trained to judge, because you're hired into these roles because of your judgment and your ability to make quick decisions.
Absolutely. And I think it's why coaching and executive coaching has been so popular the last couple of years, because it teaches that skill. And it's something also that it's important for another reason, Mark, because in terms of well-being, many busy senior executives, they suffer from a lot of stress. They suffer from poor work-life balance. And sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, the home environment could be improved. And things like active listening and leading into things like empathy, it helps in a personal sense as well. And it links to another part in the book where we were talking to the dean of Michigan Ross School of Business, Scott DeRue, and he said in their research on being well, they found that with senior leaders, if they're not well at home, they're not well at work. And if they're not well at work, they're not well at home, right? So I think that's also part of the business case, and actually, trying to train executives to be more well-rounded. It isn't just for their well-being per se, but it's also going to make them higher performers within the workplace.
Yeah. I mean, from a personal point of view, I was very lucky when I was in the corporate world, because I had a 12-minute commute on the tram. But, if I didn't make a specific choice to actually leave work behind and transition into the home place, then I just brought it back. And it ended up with that, I had a sort of what was called a work to home meditation, where you'd actually imagine leaving everything behind and leaving the suit behind and changing in, do a visualization basically, which I'm sure is, given your background, you know a lot more about it than I did, but it was very, very powerful because you're explicitly taking practical steps to make that transition.
Absolutely. It's a big pain point for many execs, just taking back their worries. It could be mentally, it could be rumination, and rumination is a big source of stress for executives. And also on a kind of action level, checking emails on smartphone and working on emails, killing some emails on the sofa when they should be with the family or eating their evening meal and things like that. So what you described is a very, very valuable ritual, right? And we often work through these type of rituals with senior execs so that they can transition effectively and maybe still be contactable, right? Maybe they still need to be contactable, but they can effectively lay down their worries and stresses of the day and be fully present with their families.
Yeah, wonderful. So let's get into rituals now. Or picking up on that language, because there's a section on the hacks, the 7 hacks of highly effective habits, and there's a great quote again. The book was so rich in terms of quoting from sources that have been helpful for me. The quote around from Maxwell, I think, you can never change your life until you change something that you do daily. So in this, just to setting this up, there are 7 different hacks. Maybe we can just focus on 2 hacks, the small ones, and hack number 1 and hack number 7. So can we start with the small one, and maybe let's introduce it from your cycling background? From the world of cycling, can we get into it from that perspective?
Sure. Yeah. The Maxwell quote, just very quickly, is I love that quote, and what we often preface that quote with our audiences by saying, you always focus on the big picture, and I think business is often about the financial year, the mission or the vision of the business quarter even, and we often overlook these small habits that we have on a daily basis, and it often could be like your commute to work, right? It could be the way that you travel to work. It could be how you the first 10 minutes of your day, right? It was a Harvard Business Review online piece a few years ago, and then the other one was how to spend the last 10 minutes of your day. So often we neglect the smaller picture, and this is what we often try and do in our work, to try and think about this daily basis, and these hacks support that. So the small thing, related in many ways to my own background in sport, and my background is in design, but I've been a competitive athlete for many years. So I'm a former duathlon champion, national champion, which is essentially triathlon for bad swimmers, if anyone doesn't know what duathlon is. So I competed internationally, and even in cycling road races, I competed at quite a high level over the years. And British cycling, track cycling specifically, really made this well known, the importance of looking at the small picture, right? So in track cycling, that you're in a velodrome and you're traveling up to maybe 70 or 80 kilometers an hour, the difference between success and failure often comes down to the width of a tire wheel or a thousandth of a second. And that's quite an intense thing, especially when you think that the real, measure of success for these guys is the Olympic Games. So, every 4 years, you're training day in, day out, so that once every 4 years, success or failure of those 4 years come down to a thousandth of a second. It's quite an intense concept. So essentially, they knew that success or failure come down to these tiny fractions. So they would look also in these same fractions for potential advantage. So they would, rub down the tires of a bicycle with alcohol after each round of a competition to remove particles of dust. They looked at the bus timetable for the Beijing Olympics. They were the only country to contract their own bus company. So that the cyclists had 15 minutes extra time in the Olympic Village to rest. So they really did look at the small picture. And the best of all that I often talk about in class, and many people will be aware of, I'm sure the last few years it's quite a popular story, is that they got the cyclists to talk to a surgeon in London to teach them how to wash their hands. Because the biggest factor in the general population catching the cold is that even if we think we wash our hands thoroughly, we always neglect the area on the back of the thumb. And the back of the thumb is where different pathogens and germs can live, and it results in us catching the cold. And you better believe that a surgeon knows how to wash their hands thoroughly. So I often ask in class, did the Great Britain cyclists have unprecedented success, which now counts in 22 gold medals in the last 3 Olympics, just because they were washing their hands better than the cyclists of France and Australia? And anytime I get an Australian student in the class and they say, no, forget about that, it's just because they had an Australian coach. So there's always some answer.
Yeah.
But it's not about that. So, this was the cumulative effect of marginal gains. And what we often say to our executive students is that, what is your daily commute? How do you engage with technology or your smartphone the first 10 minutes, last 10 minutes of your day? Can you think of psychological depletion, for example, which says that your willpower, your judgment isn't as strong in the latter half of the day? Maybe you shouldn't be taking those big decisions at 9 p.m. or even sending an email at 11 p.m. Because research also shows that if you've been awake from 6 a.m. and you're sending an email at 11 p.m., that wakefulness is probably about the same of having, 2 or 3 beers, right? Actually, that was shown in Nature in 1997. So the small aspect, because we have that cumulative effect, is something that is probably the most important thing. It's number one with good reason. And we really try and convince execs that to look at the small picture rather than just the big picture.
Yeah. And I mean, in your data, it says this is the easiest, this is the thing that most people adopt because it's a minor change, but it's easy to do, but it's also easy not to do, right? Because it is so simple. And you also say that it typically takes about 66 days for these new habits to develop. Has that been your experience?
So, yeah, so the data that you mentioned, we're continually collecting data. In that chapter, it is based on a sample of about 1,000 managers in a leading telco. And, they committed to change. They committed to changing their habits. And then we got in touch with them 100 days later, and it was self-reported. So, there's some bias in there, but we looked at the measures of their success 100 days after the commitment. So what we've found is that, if something is small, it can be forgotten about, as you say. The advantage is that it quickly gains in automaticity. So the 66 days that you mentioned is the average related to previous research from University College London, which actually looks at the degree of simplicity of the task. So something very simple like drinking a glass of water took only 20 days, but something significantly more ambitious in the research, it was, doing 50 sit-ups, took over 100 days. So it depends on how simple the task is, which is another reason that we say make it small, take baby steps, because the smaller it is, the simpler it is, the quicker it becomes automatic. And that means that you can forget about it. Because if you're a busy person and you're committing to something that's quite ambitious and complex, maybe you're very driven, that alpha, typology that many execs have. But then something else is going to come in, and maybe after 30 or 40 days, and if it's not automatic yet, maybe you're going to forget about it, or some you're going to fail essentially. So we say make it small, it becomes automatic, it's a habit, you can build on that, you can move on to something else. And the final point on making small a little bit more solid is that you can combine it with one of the other hacks. So the other thing that we found in the research is that if people committed to, we're realistic, we're not saying take all 7. It would just make you, confuse you perhaps, and it just gives you something else to do in an already busy day. But what we have found is that people who have committed to a slightly higher average of those 7, say 3 to 4, they've had a higher degree of success than the people who just had 1 or 2. So small, for example, combined with specific or shared, which gives accountability, really can make that a lot stronger. So sometimes that makes the key, right?
Yeah, you get the compounding effect within small on small plus small on something else. So let's talk about one of the other hacks, which is less about the individual proactively doing something, and it's more around the environment that they work in. Your data says this is the most effective hack, which is surroundings. Can you say a bit about that?
Yeah, so environment is split into 2. hacks essentially, which is social and surrounding. So social is our social environment and the importance of who we, our behaviours are often a reflection on the people that we spend the most time with. And surroundings is the physical environment. So in terms of even thinking about where we work on a daily basis, right? Do we work in a desk, for example, that is cluttered? Some research has shown that if you have a very cluttered desk, it results in fuzzy thinking and lack of completion of tasks and prioritization and things like that. Or even just the wider company at large. And a lot of focus has been placed on office design in the last few years to support well-being. Even biophilia, right? The importance of putting in plants or even just something that's green. Some research has shown that even the addition of house plants to a previously sterile, sparse environment has improved well-being and happiness and productivity markedly. So there's a lot of work going on in that area, and it's often the small things, right? And it relates to behavioural economics and nudging, and companies like Google have done a lot in this area, just so that people make the healthier choice. Because if you're busy and you're stressed and you've got 100 emails in your inbox and you've got a deadline, you're going to go to lunch, you're not going to think about what you're eating, but you're maybe going to eat poorly, and that's going to affect your performance and your decision making in the afternoon. And that's just one example. You could be in an office environment where it's difficult to find the staircase, so you're just spending all day waiting on an elevator. You're in and out of meetings, and when you're waiting on an elevator, as we all know, whether we're traveling for business or in our office, we'll check our smartphone, right? We'll check into email, and we never get a break. We never get a mental break. So getting back to the rituals part. And it's something that's very simple, but often very powerful. We talk to senior execs and we say, find the staircase, right? That's going to give you the mental break as well as the physical benefit. And yeah, you can try and check your email walking up and down the stairs, but it's probably a little bit more dangerous, right? So it's some of these things make a difference, the physical environment, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, you touched on nudges earlier on, but I mean, in the book, there is an example of a nudge that you use in your Leadership Academy of Barcelona. I mean, how do you think about, that's a picture to encourage people to walk up the stairs. Any other nudges that you find really works well, either in your work environment or perhaps in your personal life?
Yeah, I mean, I continually experiment, right? So there could be visual cues, like you mentioned the poster, which is it's essentially a poster that turns on its head about taking the stairs in case of an emergency. And it says, well, don't wait for an emergency, or don't wait for a fire, right? Don't wait for a fire to take the staircase. Other things could be slogans, right? We've used other ones that are figures from the past, talking about powerful quotations, could be quite powerful nudges, inspirational quotes. It's a fine line because it can become these type of 80s type, happinesses or power, and becomes very cheesy and things like that, right? So nudging, it could be, footprints on the floor. We've used that with some clients, right? So you actually, because we don't know where the staircase is, so you actually put some physical or visible footprints on the floor, and people, because their head is down, perhaps checking their email, so they see the floor and they follow these footprints towards taking the stairs. Other maybe less direct nudges are just the vending machine. What are the contents that you have in the vending machine, right? Google have played with things like the positioning of foods. So you have a refrigerator, and you don't see any contents of that refrigerator more than bottled water, and everything else, the Coca-Cola, because they still want to give choice. They don't want to be too, big brother and only give water and say you can't have a can of Coke because sometimes a can of Coke is the best thing you can have. Is that the rest of these fizzy drinks are behind frosted glass. So the nudge is to take the water because you see the water first. And then you also, if you open the fridge door, the water is at the appropriate level to grab from in terms of height. If you want a can of cola, you better prepare to dip down below or go up above. And a lot of that relates to kind of supermarket design, right? If you go to a supermarket, Nestle and the premium brands will pay extra to have their products at eye gaze level. And a lot of that links also to the, other research that has found, we're 40% more likely to eat the first thing that we see. So what we often talk about our executives is say, you go home, you're very busy, you're very tired, you're probably hungry because you've maybe skipped lunch or whatever. You open the cupboard and you eat chocolate bar because it's right there. So we say nudge, create a nudge so that you're having the healthy snacks and maybe the fruit that is visible, and you hide the chocolate down below or above, and you make that so it's a bit more of an effort to eat the unhealthy things, right? So that's a couple of little different things that we play with. And we also play with the kind of redesign or the placement of printers, for example, within an office environment, rather than everyone just, it often happens in the UK where everyone loves a cup of tea, is that they have casters on their chair and they spend all day at their desk or just rolling along in their seat towards the kettle and putting the kettle on, having a cup of tea, and then rolling back to their desk. It's like, I don't know if you've seen WALL-E, if any of the listeners have seen WALL-E from Pixar, this dystopian future where no one moves anymore. They're just on these devices that kind of float them about. It's kind of like that. So, we cut down the amount of printers, we put it at a window so they get natural light, and then they have these accidental conversations at the printer, which can actually have a business benefit. So all these redesigns, physical changes that actually nudge people towards a healthier behavior, but also behavior that supports the business results as well.
Yeah. I mean, driving the insights that underpin an innovation, essentially.
Absolutely, yeah. And we've often said that, even management by walking around or a walking meeting, you really, Stanford research showed that, just by walking on a treadmill, creativity increases. Accidental encounters at a coffee machine or a water cooler, the water cooler effect from about 30 years ago, walking meetings. Steve Jobs was a big advocate of that. And he felt that it was about building relationships, right? And a lot of innovation and insights comes from that deeper level of engagement and that deeper level of relationship. And again, it's the business case. It supports health and well-being. We feel better. We're human beings. We're not designed to sit down at an office in front of a computer for 8 or 10 hours straight. We're not designed to have a 4-hour meeting, a stand-up meeting, an ex-com that we work with in Germany, their ex-com meeting. And these ex-com meetings are very long, of course. They have it standing up. I mean, that's quite a brave thing, right? They have little tables, tall tables that they can rest on if they get tired. But what they've reported is that it makes them much more alert. It makes them much more focused than they get through that tough ex-com meeting, that long meeting by standing, right?
Yeah. And it's easy to do, but it's also easy not to do, right?
Yeah, because the orthodoxy is that we sit down, right? The orthodoxy is that we have a big office and we have the desk, and that's the way that we do business, right? We're on the phone and we're doing emails. So it isn't easy to create that culture. So it's a combination of things that is related to could be the different hacks. It is important to design the environment. But at the end of the day, it comes down to the leaders, right? And I've often talked about this. If the CEO or the senior person doesn't believe in this, it's not going to happen, which is another reason why in the book we develop the argument that well-being shouldn't just be for a well-being manager to reduce sickness or absenteeism, which is the typical approach. It should be a part of leadership development. It should be a part of how we get leaders to be more effective. And then if the rest of the organization see that the senior people, because they aspire to be them in the future, are adopting these behaviors, we call them these critical behaviors in the book, then they're going to copy that as well. And that's where we start to develop, although it's very difficult to do, we start to develop, these positive cultures.
Yeah. And it struck me, that journey from that repositioning of well-being is similar to the repositioning or how we think about diversity, because diversity in the past has been around gender and it's been around ethnicity, but there's a far broader story around diversity, which is cognitive diversity, which plays such a huge role in innovation. But again, many organizations still seem to look at it in the old way, in the same way as many organizations will look at well-being in the more traditional way as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting, there's a connection point there also, and we talk about it in the chapter where we talk about biochemistry, and there's a professor at Stanford who's looked at, the different chemicals that occur in our brain and even things like serotonin, and he says that, past the age of 50, levels of serotonin naturally decrease, and one of the biggest effects on that is that we become more risk averse. So in terms of diversity, it's about mixing in different age profiles, and also other research has shown that tolerance for ambiguity that we talked about before, teenagers are very tolerant of ambiguity, right? It's a personality trait. So, we don't say that your ex-com should be filled with teenagers, but, we say within teams, just be careful with the age profile, because if it is just the experienced, talented people, but, a natural part of what happens is that we become more risk averse, right? And of course, innovation, a lot of that is about, encouraging or balancing risk, let's say. So diversity takes that other dimension also.
Got it. Absolutely. So, before we get into the 3 questions I sent across, one final question, Stephen. You're Scottish, and we joked earlier on that it's kind of rich. A Scot talking about nutrition and health and wellness, given, I don't know how far down the list of healthy nations Scotland is, but it's certainly not at the top of that list, is it?
Yeah. And this is why, in my keynotes or classes, I'm often quite self-deprecating, and I usually say that up front. And I think that's important. Humility is important in general, right? But I think that people, when we talk about health and well-being, traditionally it's been the case that some healthy, maybe happy, but apparently healthy, physically fit person has talked about health and well-being, and they've started preaching to the audience about this is what you need to do, right? And the audience say, yeah, we know all these things. I'm not going to take it from you, right? And often executives, they may have paid attention to these things early in their life, but they become so busy that these things get thrown out the window, and maybe they become overweight, and then they become a little bit sensitive because the physical shape isn't as good as it used to be, right? And it gets back to kind of self-confidence, all these kind of things. So when I talk to people, I say, look, these things are hard. Any bad habit that you can think of, I've done it also. I still have a struggle to implement these behavior changes and to be healthy and happy and adopt good behaviors. But I know that there's a process that helps this work. And this is what I try and communicate to the people. And that seems to work to a degree, right?
Yeah, I mean, the phrase that comes to mind is, being active in your own recovery. And, as you said, it is tough to stay on the bandwagon because, as you said, I mean, the nudges are alive and well. They get, taking us in a different direction, be they in the media, be it in supermarkets, be it, the orthodoxy often is taking us in a slightly different direction anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's just so much that, we're kind of cognitive overload, right? And especially the busier people and need to absorb all those messages. So we need help, right? And this is what we try and do. We try and give a little bit of help, and we also need to look for help in our own life. So we, accountability works to different degrees depending on the personality, but just having someone else there to share the journey or to bounce ideas off or change, I think that's very important.
Yeah, brilliant. Stephen, I mean, we could go on for a long time, but time is limited. And I'm keen to get into the 3 questions which you found reasonably interesting. So let's start with the first one. What have you changed your mind about recently?
That I'm writing a little article, a little blog post on this. That was the one that I saved to last because I said I've saved this hardest question to last. And I even talked to my wife about this, and I said, what have I changed my mind about recently? And I found it difficult to answer. There's a couple of things, and it links to a quote that I said earlier, but strong opinions loosely held. I see the real importance of being able to change your mind and not just stick to something because you've adopted a position, right? Which is what certain traditional approach in business, I guess. I don't know. For me, in a general level, it's recognized in the last couple of years that I can't do it alone. And I think in my career, doing a PhD is a very lone wolf type of exercise, right? It's a 3-year thinking project, essentially. And even though I worked in design, which is by its nature very collaborative, I haven't, I founded a company myself and I have associates there. And a lot of the things I've done myself. And I think even for many years, I thought as long as I'm maintaining a very high level of performance, knocking it out the park, that's all that matters. But I think that there's more to it than that. And often clients just want a job done. And they want it done well, but they just want it done and they want something more. And that relates to relationships. So I think the last couple of years, I've tried to throw out the kind of lone wolf mentality a little bit more, just be, a bit more collaborative, a little bit more open, even just open-hearted in general. And I think that's been one thing. And even related to something, a kind of more of an epiphany last month or two. I went on a retreat with Aberkin. Aberkin is this leadership development firm of McKinsey. And we spent, with other 6 or 7 other business leaders, we were 3 days in the wilderness without technology, without even a watch. And this was a really powerful kind of introspection and a lot of meditation going on, a lot of conversations around campfires. And it was just a fantastic experience. And one of the things that I found there during one of the short meditations was just kind of being open-hearted. And I don't know if people who don't like meditation maybe just won't see this at all, but I found that as soon as I changed my thinking during that meditation, I had quite a tricky morning where I was tired, I was a little bit cranky and a little bit grumpy. And in that meditation, I started to settle down. I started to just change my kind of mindset, and I became more open-hearted for whatever that means to different people. And then in that moment, I was just more aware of the nature around me. So there's all these buzzing things and all these animals that started to come around. And I just felt that often happens in life. If we try and force things too much, or we trying to do it alone, which is often what I've done, often long-term success doesn't come from that. And I just think from being more open, aligning with the more natural flow of things, and in that case, it was nature. And then I think that's the way forward.
When I came out of the corporate world, I realized that I needed to build a network. I knew a few farmers in Thailand, but they weren't really going to help me very much. And And so, and what I didn't want to be was the person ringing up all my old network and saying, oh, I'm love to have a cup of coffee. So what I did, and it was hugely powerful, is I reached out to people, but my mind, I prepared for these conversations, and my energy was always, what can I do for you?
Yeah.
Versus, what can you do for me? And it was subtle, but it was so profound. And if I look back, a lot of the things that have happened and that we managed to put in place have come from just being, that's my example of being open-hearted. It really is a very, very powerful and simple thing.
Yeah. No, that's a great example. Absolutely.
Lovely. Okay. Second one, and I love the idea. I love epiphanies. Every time I hear the words epiphanies, my ears prick up, because we got this lovely quote someone gave us about museums being the custodians of epiphanies.
Yeah.
And I was in Barcelona the other day looking at the Pablo Picasso Museum, and the way they put art with food together. I don't know whether you've seen it. There's an exhibition at the moment.
So advertised. Yeah, I haven't been yet, but yeah, I saw it. Yeah.
It's wonderful, because what they're doing is they're pushing together different disciplines, and you see the world differently and stuff. So yeah, I love the word epiphany. Second question: where do you go to get fresh perspectives and to stay innovative and creative?
I think what really helped, that was a little bit easier for me to reflect on. I think what helps a lot is my background in design, and I've always valued empathy, challenging assumptions, and other advantages that I've lived abroad, right? So I've lived in different countries, and I think that gives you more of that open perspective and seeing things from another point of view. So generally, I've really valued that. On a more kind of concrete level, I guess there's two or three things. One is just, I'm really interested when I meet people and different people and having a conversation. And this could be, I was in India 2 weeks ago on an assignment, and a lot of times I'll talk to the driver, right? Or I'll talk to someone that is, serving breakfast. So it's not just the people in the company or the business, and that's very much a part. I need to talk to them about their personal life, family balance, all these different things. But it's just people that I meet on the journey, on the physical journey. I like to engage them, and it could be 1 minute, it could be one question, but I feel that really keeps me kind of fresh. That I'm not just talking to busy executives, right? But I'm just talking to anyone that I meet, and I just try and cultivate that curiosity of the humanity that I'm surrounded by. And I often find that I'm just so encouraged and energized by just meeting good people, right? Nice people, or people that are smiling and they're happy to tell their story. So I like to do that. Another thing that I'm trying to do more recently is just read more. And I know some people might find that, I write a lot, but my reading has been very poor, and it often came as a result of my PhD. But the PhD is like the foie gras reading method. You're force fed all these crap scientific papers, and after I finished, my reading practices went downhill. So now I'm making a big concerted effort to cultivate that curiosity through reading. We talk about it in the book. We talk about this aspect of CEO of Microsoft, talking about Carol Dweck's book, being a learn-it-all rather than a know-it-all. So I'm trying to read more. And the third and final thing is that my son is 3, and I just think about this morning, and he really makes me question things, right? And over the last couple of years, I've been looking at what is good parenting, and it's about cultivating the curiosity. It's not about giving the answer to your children. When they ask a question, it's saying, well, let's find out together, so that they think about the process whereby they can find out new things. So he's in a phase just now. He's 3 years old, and he's just asking why and how for everything, and it's kind of driving me crazy. But it's actually it's making me really think and think, yeah, I've seen this thing for 41 years of my life, but he's asking what it is because it's the first time he's seen it. And it's forcing me to just take a different perspective on something. So anyway, those are a couple of things that I'm using.
Lovely. Well, one of our previous guests actually talked about reading children's books more. I mean, he wanted to expose himself. And there are a few books out there, which I've got for our kids, which I enjoy reading, but they also enjoy reading. I mean, and I'm happy to share some of those. But I mean, it shifts the perspective somewhat. Finally, what's been your most significant, low? What have you learned from it, and how have you applied that learning, Stephen?
I talk in class a lot about the importance of failure, but it's often a different thing when it happens to yourself. And it's often about expectations, right? Because if you say, create a space for experimentation or failure, and if you're trying something different and you fail and you learn from it, that's great, because the expectation was that it was something new and you may, failure was a possible outcome. It's different when you're doing things that you think have served you well, but the context shifts. And that happened to me a couple of years ago, because I had published Sustained Executive Performance. The 2 or 3 years prior to publishing that book, I was flying. I was in a real growth curve, doing a lot of keynotes, a lot of teaching. And I thought, the book is going to come out because a lot of people were asking for the book, and I'm going to continue to fly. And I had that expectation. The book came out and things went really quiet. And I just couldn't get my head around it, and there was no real reason for it. I don't think, again, my son was born at the same time. So, did I take my foot off the gas a little bit? Perhaps. I don't know. But it was a difficult year or two. It was just 2015, 2016. And I talked to my wife about it, and she talked about this actor who was an Oscar winner, and there was an interview that they gave, and they said sometimes the phone just stopped ringing, and for no reason, right? And I started to really think through this the last couple of years, and I think it relates to a lot of some previous guests that you've had, Whitney Johnson and S-curves, and we also have a chapter on S-curves in the book. I had an expectation or a belief that I was on the first part of the really steep part of that S-curve, and I thought the book was just going to fly me up the rest of it, whereas in hindsight, the book was the end point of that previous curve. So basically, the book came out, I was at that level of maturity of that last curve, and I'm looking at the new curve. So basically, since that came out, I've been kind of transitioning. So yeah, was it failure? It wasn't a concrete failure, but it was basically I was switching to a new curve. A lot of things went down. I became less busy. The company was turning over less on an annual basis. Some of the client relationships that we had for a long time just fell by the wayside. They just came to a natural end. So that was a difficult couple of years, right? And I think I'm hoping, and I read Whitney Johnson's second to last book recently. I'm hoping now that we're on the start of the steep part of this new curve, but who knows, right? Hindsight's a wonderful thing. But I guess in terms of failure, so learning, I guess you have to be persistent. You have to keep knocking on the door, but sometimes you just have to look for a different door to knock on, right? And there's many, many other things that you can do instead of just keeping digging the same hole, which a lot of us are guilty of doing, perhaps. Just look and start digging a fresh hole and just go somewhere else. I don't know if digging a hole is a nice metaphor. It's a negative thing, but I guess that's my answer to that one.
Lovely. Super. So, Steven, where can people get in touch with you?
So yeah, the website of the Leadership Academy Barcelona is probably the best bet, which is thelab, THELABCN.com. And we're also through the lab and my own, Steven MacGregor, or sometimes as Dr. Steven MacGregor, Steven with a V and MacGregor MAC on social media or LinkedIn, all the usual channels, then I'll be pretty easy to get a hold of.
Great. Well, we'll put all that in the show notes. And, it's been great to have you back on the program. I really enjoyed the conversation, and, best of luck with your podcast, with the book, and with the next leg up your new curve.
Hopefully. No, I really enjoyed it, Mark. Many, many, many thanks.
Great. Have a great day.
Cheers. All the best.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi, it's Mark again. I was struck re-listening to this interview by Steven's humility and how he admits to telling his students that he is guilty of every single bad habit that you can think of. But also, like Ed Hess, a previous guest at the beginning of this season, Steven constantly is learning and adapting and trying new things out. And his answers to the 3 questions that I ask all my guests at the end of each interview is a really good example of this mindset in action. I was also intrigued to learn more about nudges in the workplace. For example, how the positioning of a printer in the office or a bottle of Coke in the fridge can change behaviors. And my personal example of this was moving my coffee machine down into the basement at home. So at least I'm getting a little exercise when I reach for another shot of caffeine. Now, all of these small improvements add up to big gains, which is why he encourages his clients to create space in their busy lives and to look at the small picture, because that's where the opportunities for making quick, impactful, and sustainable changes actually lie. So as you can probably tell, I love my chat with Steven. And once again, I'm really grateful to be able to bring the insights and experiences from such accomplished and fascinating people and their fresh perspectives to you, our listeners here at the Innovation Ecosystem podcast. So this is Mark Bidwell, changing perspectives, one podcast at a time.